Hello, and welcome back to the Quilters Creative Podcast. Today, we're talking about the working life of the 18th century embroidery techniques. In the 18th century, embroidery was the highest paid trade for women, although men in the guild were paid more. The daily wage was in proportion to the amount of thread or gold that had been stitched and the skill of the worker. The working day was from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., and the embroiderer was expected to work longer to complete orders on time. We have pattern drawing. The initial preparation for a commission piece was the most important stage and was usually undertaken by a master embroiderer. The embroiderer or a professional pattern drawer would draw a design as a simple line representation of the purposed work for the approval of the client. The full-size design would be traced on an oiled or transparent paper, and this was then placed on top of another sheet of paper and pricked through with a sharp needle or an awl. Pattern drawing was a separate trade in England in the 18th century, as if the embroidery was for a dress, such as a lady's robe or a gentleman's waistcoat, a client could choose designs from a folio of drawings, which was usually painted with watercolors. The motifs or borders would be traced and repeated as many times as necessary and arranged to fit the garments required. The shape and size of the garment pattern pieces would have to be known, as the embroiderer was worked on a flat fabric, and making up the garment was done afterwards by a dressmaker or a tailoring workshop. The tracing of the embroidery in the garment pieces would then be placed over another piece of paper and pricked through as before. The 18th century dressmakers and tailors would have take a client's measurements by making notches along a strip of paper. This would be noted as a logical order, starting with the smallest first. The next step was to place the pricked paper over the smooth fabric. The grain lines were matched up and the pattern pieces were positioned on the fabric as economically as possible. The pricking was held in place by pins or weights, and the design was then transferred to the fabric by pouncing a colored dust through the pinholes of the pricking, which was done by one of two methods. The first method was a pounce bag filled with crushed chalk, cinnamon, charcoal, or even powdered wine dregs, depending on the color of the fabric. The bag was dabbed or pounced along the prick lines of the design, leaving an impression of tiny dots of powder on the fabric. The pricking would then be carefully removed so not to disturb the marks. The second method used a small roll of felt, which was dipped into a saucer of pounced powder and then dabbed along the prick lines. The pricking could be removed, shake off excess powder, and reverse for the opposite front or repeated of the motif around the hem of a skirt. Mistakes could lightly be brushed away, but the correct lines had to be treated gently so that the image did not disappear before it had been inked in. This was done by a fine paintbrush or pen with ink made from India blue or white lead. White lines showed quite clearly on white fabrics, particularly those with shiny surface, such as satin. The lines had to be finely and accurately drawn. Afterwards, the fabric was lightly shaken to remove the pounce, which would dull the threads if left on the surface. From fabrics with a pile such as velvet, the design was drawn on thin green transparent paper or fine silk gauze and attached to the fabric with little tacking stitches that fell within the motif. The embroidery was then worked through all the layers and hid the tacking stitches. The paper gauze acted as a slight padding to the motif and prevented the stitches from becoming lost in the pile. Surplus paper or gauze would tear away quite easily along the perforated made by the needles. Kind of like how we do foundation paper piecing today. Metallic and glazed fabrics often resisted the ink markings, and so another method was employed. The design was transferred by prick and pounce on the reverse of the fabric, and the ink in with heavy black lines. This would show through significantly for the embroiderer to be worked. Transparent fabrics such as gauze, fine silk, and muslin could be placed over the drawing design and traced direct with pen and ink. As well as working to commission, items were embroidered for stock. There remain many examples of waistcoats that were still in one piece and have been made up into an actual garment. Dressing the frame. When the transfer of the design was complete and edges were not salvaged, any edges that were not salvages were reinforced with tape or ribbon. The side edge was taped and string loops were sewn along the edge in readiness for lacing the sides of the frame. Stretching the prepared fabric was another stage that was actually undertaken by the master embroiderer or performed under his supervision. The fabric had to be stretched with the weft and warp at right angles. If it was off grain, the finished embroidery would pucker and twist when it was released from the frame. The fabric had to be at just the right degree of tautness. Too slack, and the embroidery wouldn't be even. Too tight, and the fabric would split. As this required a working knowledge of textile properties and the fabric's tensile strength. It also required immense human strength and some assistance to pull the rollers apart, satisfactory in large frames. The two rollers were placed parallel to one another, supporting at one end by the wall brace and at the other by the trestle. The webbings or leather strips would face inwards from underneath. Embroiderers always rolled the rollers on top of the stretched fabric so that the already worked embroidery was rolled inside and protected. Quilters, on the other hand, rolled the work sections to the outside. The salvaged or taped edge of the prepared fabric was pinned in lengths of webbing exactly in the middle, then stitched to the webbing from the center out to the sides, stretching the fabric very slightly. This was repeated on the other side on the opposite roller. Excess fabric was wound around the rollers, leaving a working width that was convenient for the workers, usually 2-hand span. The fabric wound round the rollers was padded with paper, linen, or cotton cloth to prevent markings. If possible, the embroiderer would work from the middle to the outside to avoid rolling up worked embroidery. The lasts were placed into the slots in the rollers to form the sides. The far corners were fixed by pegs pushed into the holes in the lath. The rollers nearest the worker was then prized outwards with a tightening screw. This was a strong pointed iron rod that was placed in a hole in the lath through the slot of the roller. When the fabric was stretched as tight as possible, the pegs were inserted in the lath holes on this side. It was a dangerous job, as the tightening screw could slip, the frame collapse, and the tension lath cause an injury. The fabric, being stretched vertically, was then laced up the sides to stretch it horizontally. This was done with a ball of string and large needles. The string passed around the lath and through the loops on the edge of the fabric. This was repeated on the opposite side. One end of the string was knotted around the lath. Then the lace was symmetrically tightened and the other end fixed to the lath. Care had to be taken not to pull the one side more than the other, and this would cause the grain of the fabric to be disturbed. At this stage, the rollers could be further tightened and the pegs adjusted. When the rollers were finally long, very long, they tend to bow in the middle. This was corrected by inserting the brace, which held the rollers apart at a consistent distance. If the fabric was difficult to handle or pre-cut to shapes, then a slightly different method was used. A linen mount would be stretched as described and the fabric placed on top, pinned and tacked around. The frame would be turned over and the linen cloth cut away from the areas to be embroidered. Alternatively, the linen could be left as an interfacing or a lining. Work in progress. The embroidery had to be kept clean at all times and was draped with dust cloth and layers of paper. The only exposed area was the part being worked. On a large frame, 2 or 3 embroiderers could work alongside one another. Each embroiderer would progress with his or her hands on a piece of paper to prevent perspiration marking the work. For a last-minute addition to the center of a large piece, an embroiderer could crouch beneath the frame and pass the needle to the worker above. Can you imagine sitting underneath a huge frame and just poking a needle up and then someone else poking it down to you? That would wear on your back. The workroom itself would ideally have good lighting and high ceilings. However, near the frame or even balanced on it, the embroiderers will also have a candlestick in a dish, complete with a handle and a snuffer. Sometimes these would have small shades to screen the glare of the flame in the eyes. Left-handed and right-handed workers sat opposite one another so that their working arms did not block the light. Embroidering at home. Not everyone ordered expensive embroidery garments from professional workshops. Many wives, sisters, and daughters were talented needle women and enjoyed spending their spare time using a needle. Gown lengths and waistcoat pieces were often embroidered at home and sent to a dressmaker or a tailor to be made up. Young girls stitched small accessories such as white work cuffs, handkerchiefs, and apron as part of their general education. Ladies' maid did plain functional sewing such as night and underclothes, but were also capable of repairing garments. As clothes were expensive, many costumes were remodeled using ready-made trims. Large old-fashioned robes from the first half of the century could be unpicked and remade into a completely different garment. Haberdashers sold lace, trimmings, ribbons, ruffles alongside aprons, gloves, stockings, and hats. Do you take and use old fabric in your quilting today? Patterns and embroidery designs were published by 1770 in the Ladies' Magazine to keep everyone up to date with the latest fashions. Less prosperous families made all their own clothes and was a brisk trade in the second-hand garments. Many items of clothing were left in wills or bequests to be passed on to relatives and servants. So I hope you got something out of this podcast. And if there's something that you would like to learn more about, comment below. And let me know how you embroider your modern embroidery today. And until then, happy stitching, my friends.